in 1746. And so I think that what these militias tell us a wee bit about is why the government survived. So let's crack into it. And of course, you just have to begin with Maurier's famous picture of Culloden, probably the most famous picture of Culloden. I'm not actually going to talk about Culloden, but I just thought I'd throw it up there at the start, because I think if you talk about the Jacobite Rebellion and don't show this picture, people start to complain. So there it is there. One of the the fascinating things about this particular image is that it was actually painted with Jacobite prisoners. Jacobite prisoners were actually used to stage this, and so the supposition has been over time that this is probably an extremely accurate reflection of what the Jacobites might have worn at the battle, because it was prisoners of war that were used to paint it. Anyway, slight aside. So let's crack on. The raising of the Jacobite standard at Glenfinnan on the 19th of August 1745 found the British state woefully ill-prepared. After previous Jacobite rebellions in 1715 and 1719, both failures, the government had invested heavily in the Highlands and Islands, building a series of fortifications and roads to connect them. But memories are short, and government hates spending money. And so after significant investment in the 1720s, the 1730s saw a gradual withdrawal of government intervention in the Highlands. The garrisons at Fort William, Fort Augustus, Ruthven Barracks, Bernera, Fort George, a small one in Inverness, they were left to kind of wither, and the garrisons were left there chronically under strength. In 1745, the garrison of Ruthven Barracks was 12 men. The wider War of the Austrian Succession, which Britain was fighting against France at the time, also had an impact on government intervention in the Highlands. There was a regiment of Highlanders in the British Army, the Frechagendu, the Black Watch, at the time numbered the 43rd Foot, but it subsequently became the 42nd Foot. They had been raised in the Highlands to help the government control the region. But in the early 1740s, they had been withdrawn from Scotland and sent to fight in Europe with the rest of the British Army. The result was that there was hardly any government troops in Scotland when the rising broke out. The commander-in-chief in Scotland, a man named Sir John Cope, probably had about 2 understrength regiments of inexperienced infantry and 2 regiments of dragoons to defend the whole of Scotland, probably less than 3,000 men. And most of these were distributed in tiny little garrisons across. Effectively, the government was like criminally unprepared for the rising of Charles Edward Stuart. As a result, and contrary to the wishes of quite a lot of English ministers in the government, the government under Henry Pelham realized that if they were going to have any chance of stamping out this rebellion, hopefully before it even got going, a lot would depend on how people in Gaelic-speaking Scotland, the Highlands and Islands, actually reacted to the rebellion. John Hay, 4th Marquis Tweeddale, the guy in the centre there, he was the Secretary of State for Scotland at the time, and he was determined to limit unrest to the Highlands as much as possible. The previous rebellions had all been sealed into the Highlands. They had been threats to the government position in Scotland. There's no doubt of that. But the military strength of the rebels had been kind of sealed into the Highlands. And his plan was basically to repeat that. As concern about the rising gathered pace, as men flocked to the Jacobite standard, as it looked as though actually the rebel army might move beyond the Highlands and into lowland Scotland, a number of figures turned around and started saying, we need Highlanders in our army. We need to draw off the recruits for the rebels and instead bring them over to us. Foremost among these figures was a man, Field Marshal Second Earl of Stair, John Dalrymple. In his late 60s, that's an early picture of him there on the right. In his early 60s, by 1745, he was a highly respected officer. He'd commanded the British Army at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. Incidentally, the last time a British army in the field had been commanded by the monarch, George II, had actually, officially commanded the army at Dettingen, but it was actually the Earl of Stair who'd, really ran things. He was the most senior officer in the British Army at the time. He lived in London, and he's sending frantic letters to everybody in Scotland who will listen, like, get Highlanders, get the men that might join the rebels into our army. And it was probably on Stair's recommendation that the Prime Minister, Henry Pelham, there on the left, decided in 1745 that they were going to raise 20 companies of Highland infantry to fight the rebels. A company being probably around 100 men. Plan was, we'll raise 2,000 Highlanders to really, nip this rebellion in the bud. As Stair said, quote, "The people upon the place are certainly the best judges of what is proper to be done, and where proper encouragements are to be given to people who show their zeal for the good of the country." It was to the government's great advantage that they could call upon several kind of reliable allies in the Highlands and Islands. The most important of these was Duncan Forbes of Culloden. He was the Lord President of the Court of Session, probably the most senior legal officer in Scotland, and he was an acknowledged expert on Highland affairs. He was basically the government's man on the ground in the Highlands. And what his job effectively was to ensure that the rebels, that these independent companies were established as quickly as possible so they could get into the field and fight the rebels. He wasted little time. From his base at Culloden House, and of course there is a huge irony here, his home base was Culloden House, which will later come to feature in the famous battle the following April. He quickly went about trying to dispense army commissions to people he thought would come to the banner, trying to pressure people who might think they might go over to the Jacobites. With great flattery, but with not unwarranted sentiment, the Under Secretary of State for Scotland told Forbes that if he was able to raise these companies, quote, "You will have done more, you have done the most essential service to this government that has in my memory been performed by any subject." So armed with 60 blank commissions, 60 kind of, bits of paper that made people officers in these new independent companies, Forbes worked tirelessly to pressure and cajole a bunch of clan leaders into joining the government's armed forces, these militias. He's facing a huge problem, though, because loyalties are immensely complicated. You've got the loyalties of clan, you've got the loyalties of family, you've got the loyalties of region, you've got the loyalties of religion, and then you've got the loyalties of Jacobitism or pro-Hanoverian government sentiment resting on top of that. And Forbes knows that if he's just going to give these army commissions to the people he can trust, he's not actually going to draw anybody away from the Jacobites. So he has to tread this very fine line of negotiating with people that he already knows are recruiting for the Jacobites in the hope that he's going to turn them over to his side. It's a really, really hard thing to kind of manage. To be honest, it's next to impossible. And I think, he probably deserves immense credit. There are times where he kind of believed people a little too long. He knows fine well they're recruiting for the Jacobites and he's still believing that they're loyal. But he was facing almost an impossible position of trying to, reward people that he knows are loyal, but also bring people over with this kind of government patronage and this government pay and these army commissions that he knows are already actively recruiting for the Jacobites. So a couple of the people he offered military commissions to actually ended up joining the Jacobites. Probably the best examples being Donald Cameron of Lochiel, the gentle Lochiel as he was known, one of them. I think, you know, in any rebellion, usually the cast of characters are a bunch of ne'er-do-wells and quite often failures. Donald Cameron Lochiel, when you kind of read his letters, read the kind of man he was, probably one of the most sympathetic characters of the entire rebellion. Anyway, he's offered an army commission, he turns it down and joins the Jacobites. The Earl of Cromarty, likewise, he's offered a commission and still ends up joining the Jacobites. I do, and from the point of view of divided loyalties, the reason I have this image up, this is a fascinating image, and it kind of really gives you a sense of not only the divided loyalties that exist in Scotland in 1745, but also the way the memory kind of works in Scotland. You know, it's like, this is the thing I love about history. History is not what actually happened. History is, you know, why we think it happened the way it did. You know, it's much more about us than really it is often about the historical characters we're talking about. This is one of the, this is a platoon standard from one of the independent companies, one of the companies, one of these militia companies that was raised in Scotland to fight the Jacobites. It's currently in the hands of the Bell MacDonald family at Rammerscales Estate. And according to family legend, this was a Jacobite flag that after the Jacobite rebellion, what they did was, apparently, according to family legend, there were 4 thistles in each of the corner. And when the Jacobite rebellion failed, the family decided, oh, this doesn't look good. So they unstitched one of the thistles and put a nice big British Union flag to replace one of those thistles. It's a wonderful story. According to family legend, you know, that their family were chased out of Skye for loving the Jacobites. You know, they redid this flag and they went to live in the lowlands. Unfortunately, it's highly unlikely to be true. The family were actually staunchly pro-government, and this flag was probably not altered. This flag probably had the Union Jack on it from the very beginning. But it's just an interesting kind of indication of, you know, how loyalties are divided, but also how memory works. You know, everybody wants to be a Jacobite. You know, once it failed, everybody claims they were a Jacobite to begin with. It's not actually true. A lot of people supported the government. The biggest question, of course, is over Clan Fraser. And again, this is an indication of the divided loyalties that exist in Scotland at the time. Clan Fraser is led by the guy on the right, the 11th Lord Lovat. And of course, you may be familiar with this image of him. This is Hogarth's famous image of him just before he's executed after the rebellion. And it's probably the most famous image of him. And he looks like a wee bit of a nasty piece of work. But again, a lot of propaganda exists in rebellions, and Lord Lovat it kind of becomes this fall guy on account of the government. He's kind of portrayed as this man that is corrupt and venal and the perfect example of what a Jacobite was. I hate using that image precisely because it seems to support, you know, the kind of government interpretation of Jacobitism. This is Simon Fraser, as probably he should be known. The biggest, as I say, question mark is over Clan Fraser. Which way is Clan Fraser going to go? Because whichever way Clan Fraser goes, there is a huge number of smaller cadet branches and clans that are going to go with them. Forbes is desperate to get Lord Lovat on side. The problem is that in the run-up to the rebellion, Lord Lovat has been begging the government for patronage, for access to government resources, and he's been constantly pushed back and pushed back. So since about 1737, he's been plotting a Jacobite return. So Forbes is kind of writing to Simon Fraser. He's saying, please, come over and join us. Simon Fraser's responding, saying, oh, yeah, I'm a big one for the government, love the government, yeah, great government, Henry Pelham, all about him. All the time working for the Jacobites. And actually his clan ends up attacking Culloden House and chasing Duncan Forbes away to Inverness. And all the while Forbes is kind of, still believing that Simon Fraser is still on his side. Another good example of the kind of divided loyalties, the man on the left there, Ewan Macpherson of Cluny. Cluny Macpherson, probably, the head of one of the most notorious Jacobite clans, the Macphersons, actually from Badenoch, the area where I am at the moment. He had actually accepted a British Army commission a few years before, and he initially brings his clan out for the government. Unfortunately, he's captured by the Jacobites pretty early on during the Rising, and he swaps sides, and he ends up becoming a colonel in the Jacobite army. Again, it's, these loyalties are really, really tricky. Anyway, all these difficulties of loyalties aside, what ends up happening ultimately is Forbes ends up recruiting successfully at 18 of the 20 companies. There are 4 companies raised by Clan MacLeod on Skye. Norman MacLeod of MacLeod, the man named Caledonia, the wicked man. He didn't have the best reputation. I think I saw somebody with a MacLeod surname in there, so I do apologise about your ancestor. There's another 3 companies raised by Lord Fortrose and Clan Mackenzie over in Easter Ross. There's 2 companies raised by MacDonald of Slate, also on Skye. There's 2 raised by the Earl of Sutherland. There's 2 raised by Clan Mackay. There's 1 each from Grant of Rothiemurchus, MacLeod of Ascent, Clan Monroe. William Ross of Invercastley raises a company, and the town of Inverness under a man named William McIntosh also raises a company. So in the end, they get 1,800 of the 2,000 they'd planned. Organizationally speaking, these companies are slightly unusual. They're not part of the regular army. They're called independent companies, but they go by many of the kind of same rules and organizations as the rest of the army. They can, however, I think properly be called clan companies, because the officer commissions all go to people who are related, people who are central to their clans. Most of the troops themselves come from the estates of these clan leaders. They really are clan organizations. Also mobilized at this time, and actually one thing I should just add very quickly in addition is that these clans, they're not given on the basis of strategic necessity. They're basically given out to whoever's willing to raise men, and also how politically significant they might be. So Grant of Rothiemurchus, for example, his company's kind of out there. He's away from the kind of main other centres of government support. Grant of Rothiemurchus, their territories adjoin territories run by the Duke of Gordon and the Macphersons. So he's right in the heart of Jacobite territory. But he's given a company, not so much because he's going to be useful, but because it would be a great offence to Clan Grant if they didn't get a company. And that's that's the kind of nature of these things. It's not really military necessity that's working here. It's actually politics that's really taking the lead. Also mobilized at this time was something called the Argyll Militia, or the Campbell Regiment of Militia, which is more famous for its role at Culloden. It's actually the final battle of the rebellion, the Battle of Culloden. They are actually part of the government army on that day. They're on the left flank of the government army. They're the ones that actually kind of tear down the turf dikes that are on the right wing of the Jacobite army. It allows the dragoons and the cavalry of the government army to kind of work their way around the Jacobite flank, and then ultimately to cut down the fleeing Jacobites and also civilians. You know, like, I mean, I think everybody knows just how horrifically the government army operates during and after Culloden, and the Campbell Militia are very much part of that. That regiment is the Campbell Regiment of Militia is similar to the independent companies, but they're also slightly different. They're a different organization. They're run by the Campbells, and they're recruited by not so much by volunteers, which is how the independent companies are raised, but they are recruited by quotas from every major estate. So every major estate had to provide a certain number of men. Those who could afford hired substitutes. So if you were selected, you know, in this kind of draft, you could hire a substitute. So this famous poet, Donnacha Ban MacIntyre, he's the most famous Gael, famous Gaelic speaker to fight for the Hanoverian regime in 1745. He's actually the hired substitute for a man called Archibald Fletcher of Cranach. He was paid, or he wasn't actually paid in the end, but I'll get to that in a second. He was to be given the sum of £16, 17 shillings and sixpence for serving as the substitute. Now, to give you a kind of sense of that, that's a lower middle class wage in Scotland in 1745. So it's, you know, it's not a bad payday for him. Ultimately, however, he's refused payment because Archibald Fletcher had given him his grandfather's sword to go off and fight against the Jacobites. Donnacha Ban is at the Battle of Falkirk, where the government forces are defeated, and he drops the sword on the way. And so Archibald Fletcher refuses to pay him, which is, I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. But this is a really important warning. Never offend poets, particularly very good poets. And so what Donnacha Ban ends up doing in revenge for not being paid is he writes this very famous poem, Oren dan Blar English of Rish, which is the poem about the Battle of Falkirk, where he insults both the sword and Archibald Fletcher for having given it to him. He calls it, and I'm trying to think of the exact wording he uses, but basically the translation he calls it a notched sword of ill luck, like a bannock turning board, you know, a board that you use to flip pancakes effectively. I think the lesson here is never offend a poet. It's like the lesson of the American and French revolutions: never offend lawyers and newspapermen. You know, if you can keep them on your side, you've got a much better chance of holding things together. So what does all this mean? You know, what does this mean in terms of numbers? Why are all these troops important? Well, I think the numbers raised in these independent companies in the Campbell Regiment of Militia, they very much qualify the view that the Jacobites were more successful in raising Scots than the government forces were. The best intelligence, or the best estimates we kind of have, is that by Christmas 1745, there's probably about 4,700 Highlanders in government uniforms, around 2/3 of whom had been raised in Argyll. At a time when the estimated Jacobite strength across the whole of Scotland is only about 4,000 men, that is a significant number of people. Argyll alone raised more men for the government than the entire Jacobite army that marched into Edinburgh before the Battle of Prestonpans. And indeed, the numbers are actually astonishing. So typically speaking, when we think about the Jacobite rebellion, we assume that the Highlands are Jacobite and the Lowlands are pro-government. These numbers actually flip that in many ways, because the Lowlands, much more populous than the Highlands, they only raise about 2,000 men for the government across the whole of the rebellion. The Highlands raise more than double that to fight for the government, as well as, of course, the ones that joined the Jacobites. So from a purely numerical perspective, what I'm basically saying is the Highlands were as pro-government as they were pro-Jacobite. So So much for numbers. What about battlefield performance? Well, historians have kind of followed the model again of Hanoverian commentators from the 18th century in basically dismissing the independent companies and their Argyll militia as being highly ineffective. Historians have said things like, quote, they did not amount to much. They were an indifferent presence in battle, and, quote, they were not equal to the task of suppressing Jacobitism. I think this is nonsense, personally. Now, granted, their battlefield performance is not perfect. But I think if I run through a couple of kind of what they did during the rebellion, I think this view that they're completely useless is very easily challenged. Their first operation was the successful relief of Fort Augustus, right in the middle of the map there in November 1745. Basically, the companies organized themselves in Inverness, and in November 1745, they marched down the Great Glen down to Fort Augustus, the fortress in the center of the map there. It was besieged by Clan Fraser under Charles Fraser of Inveralchy, who is kind of a character in the Outlander books, if that's a care for you. They march down and they drive the Clan Fraser away. They secure Fort Augustus for the government. They are less successful at a place called Inverurie in December 1745. They march again out of Inverness and they march across to Aberdeenshire towards the right-hand side of the map. To basically drive off Jacobite recruiting parties in Aberdeenshire. The problem is that they run straight into a Jacobite force that's twice their number and includes not just kind of Jacobite rebels, but also regular professional French soldiers, actually Irishmen fighting in the French army, the Irish piquets. And they put up a good fight. And this is, I think I saw somebody in the, again, this is, I called your ancestor a wicked man earlier on, but Clan MacLeod, it's the Clan MacLeod companies that fight this battle. And they do remarkably well. They're outnumbered 2-1. They're fighting professional soldiers, and yet they inflict more casualty or as many casualties on the Jacobites as they sustain in their stead. And they are they're eventually forced to withdraw. The most embarrassing moment, I think, on either side during the entire rebellion is something called the Rout of Moy. And if you look in the center of the map there, Moy is, kind of near Inverness. This is a place where it really is quite embarrassing. In February 1746, there's a rumor that Bonnie Prince Charles Edward Stuart, is staying at Moy House, which is only a few miles from Inverness. So they get 12 of the companies together and they go marching after him. And he is actually there. And he's only defended by some servants and some bodyguards. And so what these servants and bodyguards do is they go out in the nighttime and they start making a lot of noise as if there are many more of them than there actually are. And these 12 companies stumbling about in the dark, they get scared and they turn around and they run away. And this is kind of like, I mean, it is truly embarrassing, but it's kind of unfairly become the famous part of the rebellion from the point of view of the independent companies. And I think it's a wee bit kind of on the unfair side. They also have another couple of successes. What's known as the Skirmish of Tongue in the far north there. The Skirmish of Tongue was when the independent companies managed to successfully seize arms and supplies, including £13,000 in gold that had come off a French ship. And they march up there and they surprise the Jacobites and they take that money. And it's in part because they secure that money that the Jacobites don't have any money to pay their soldiers or pay for food before Culloden, which means that the soldiers are marching to Culloden, having not eaten for 3 days and hadn't been paid for months. And that is the independent companies that do that. They also surprise a Jacobite force that comes to try and take back the gold at a place called the Battle of Little Ferry a short time later. So they're not, what I'm really trying to say here is they're not completely useless, not by any stretch. And in fact, in one crucial respect, they're incredibly important to the defeat of the Jacobites. The Jacobite rebellion takes place within a divided society. One historian has said that the success of the 45 hinged on the ability of clan leaders to keep their followers together. If the Jacobites could control territory, they could control the resources and people of those territories. What the independent companies effectively do, operating out of Inverness, is they deny freedom of movement to the Jacobites. They deny their ability to recruit men and to gather resources from across the Highlands. And in that respect, they're utterly critical to the defeat of the rebellion. And this is precisely what has led a man named Stephen Jeffrey, a historian Stephen Jeffrey, to call the Edinburgh Council of 1745 the real turning point of the rebellion. You know, people talk about the turning points of the rebellion, you know, and mostly it's when you talk about the turning point, it's usually the retreat from Derby that is cited as the most important turning point. Basically, the Jacobite army decides after it's captured Edinburgh, they march into England. They actually get to within 125 miles of London. And at a place called Derby, they turn around and they march home. And, you know, all sorts of amateur historians will tell you that's the turning point of the rebellion. If they just kept marching to London, they might have secured the capital and the Jacobites would have won. For my money, I think it's nonsense. There are already, you know, two government armies between them and the capital. I don't think it's going to happen. The real turning point of the rebellion, arguably, is the decision to actually march into England in the first place. The Jacobite army decides in December 1745 they're going to march into England. There's a good case to be made that had the Jacobites just stayed in Scotland, they would have had far more success. Now, granted, this would have surrendered the initiative to the government. At the same time, what it would have allowed the Jacobites to do is to clear out the remaining government garrisons in Scotland, because the Jacobites lack heavy artillery. So all of the government forts basically remain in government hands, which means these independent companies in Inverness and government garrisons at Ruthven, at Fort Augustus, at Bernera, they basically operate as kind of almost like aircraft carriers in the middle of Jacobite territory. They can launch patrols out into Jacobite glens, preventing the Jacobites from gathering men and supplies and money. They are actually kind of in the rear of the Jacobite army, making life difficult for the Jacobites. Had the Jacobites just stayed in Scotland, yes, they probably would have surrendered the initiative to the government, but they could have suppressed this danger in their rear, and that would have allowed them to have far greater access to the people and resources of Scotland in general, which could have had all sorts of implications had France decided to actually commit more resources to Scotland as part of this rebellion. The other thing is these independent companies actually prevent an awful lot of troops from joining the Jacobites. The kind of primary task of these independent companies was not to defeat the Jacobites in the field. It's basically to bring fire and sword to Jacobite glens. And in fact, that's what the Earl of Stair says at the beginning of the rebellion. Your job is to make Jacobites leaving their glens to go to the rest of Scotland or into England miserable. And I've got his quote, you know, I've got a quote from him here, which is, you know, like, it really kind of gives you a sense of just, you know, the mindset of these government ministers at the time. He says, you are to bring fire and sword to their glens so that their march south comes at the price of abandoning their cattle, their houses, their wives and their children to the mercies of their enemies. And this they did. This is exactly what the independent companies do. The Jacobite commander in Scotland during the march into England, a man named Lord Drummond, he estimated after the rebellion that the independent companies, these 2,000 guys in Inverness, probably prevented the recruitment of about 6,000 Jacobites to the main Jacobite army, because no Jacobite wants to leave their glen at the mercy of government troops who are so close to them. So, it's really, really worth kind of thinking about them in those kind of terms. And, to kind of put this in context, it's kind of like talking about the militias during the American Revolution. Like the old kind of thing is the militias never stood up to the British Army. No, they didn't, but that wasn't their job. Their job was to deny space, freedom of movement, resources, and territory to the British Army. And that's exactly what they did. And they were highly successful at doing it. And from that point of view, the militias have a tremendous role in the defeat of the British Army during the American Revolution, because the British Army can't move as it wants to. In territories where they have where the militias are. They can't recruit men, they can't gather supplies, they can't purchase whatever they want. And so during the Jacobite Rebellion, these militias operate in exactly the same way and do so exactly as effectively. There's one other thing that's just maybe worth saying very briefly, and I'll kind of try and walk you through just a little bit of the campaign, and then we'll move on to the final wee bit of what I'm going to say today. This is kind of the situation in Scotland as the Jacobite army retreats from England. There are basically small government garrisons at Fort Augustus and Ruthin Barracks, those two lower little red dots. And then you've got the main concentration of the independent companies in Inverness. What I should also add is that there's a large concentration of Argyll militia over in Argyll, which is kind of, how best to say this, if you kind of go diagonally left and down from that concentration of three red dots, that's down into to Argyll and Kintyre. That's where another main concentration of government troops are. The main government army marches up into Scotland. It's defeated at Falkirk in January 1746. But what it does is it forces the main Jacobite army, the blue there, to start retreating north. And as the Jacobite army starts to retreat north, what it suddenly realizes is that it's got all of these government troops in its rear. So the main Jacobite army, as the main government army heads over to Aberdeen to rest for the winter, the main Jacobite army suddenly finds itself having to fight all these government troops. And they do so successfully. They chase the government army out of Inverness. They pursue them up the coast of Easter Ross. Eventually, those government troops kind of head cross country to Skye, and they don't take any further part in the campaign. But in trying to reduce all these garrisons, the Jacobite main army gets torn in multiple directions, which means when the main government army starts to march from Aberdeen towards Inverness, the Jacobite army can't collect in time to meet them at the River Spey, which is that river between the two main armies there. There is a good argument to be made that had the Jacobites been able to get their act together, had they been able to supply their troops, pay their troops, and get them onto the River Spey in time to meet the main government army, you might have seen this rebellion go well into summer. Cumberland, who's in charge of the main government army, his biggest fear is that the Jacobites are going to hold the line of the River Spey. But they can't, because they're distributed all over the place, chasing these government garrisons around and trying to gather money and supplies that they've not been able to do because those government garrisons have been there. The result is they don't get to the river in time, and the government army is able to cross it, and that's when you get the Battle of Culloden. So what I'm really saying here is these government forces, they are not some small part of this rebellion. They are not some, kind of sideshow. I would go so far as to say they might be one of the most critical elements of the defeat of the Jacobites. So, Connie, can I just very quickly ask, how much time do you think I might have left? I don't want to overstep my mark.
As much as you want. We're hanging on your every word.
Yeah, don't tell me that. Right. Well, what I'll try and do is I'll maybe go maybe another 5-10 minutes, just to leave plenty of time for questions and not to kind of impinge upon your patience.
Please do, Matthew.
Yeah. Um, there's another respect in which we can kind of say that the independent companies are important. And that's not so much the military side of things, but the kind of political side of things. I think the mobilization of these independent companies actually tells us an awful lot about how the government survives the rebellion of 1745. It's a well-established fact that the Act of Union, the Treaty of Union, signed between Scotland and England in 1707, is not popular in Scotland. It will become popular. What the Treaty of Union eventually did was it gave Scotland access to the wider English Empire, and Scots are going to become a major part of the British Empire, taking advantage of political appointments, education, medicine, trade. Scots, wherever you find the British Empire, you will find a very strong contingent of Scots. That is the reality of it. But in the first half of the 18th century, those benefits have not emerged yet. And the Act of Union, the Treaty of Union between Scotland and England, is deeply unpopular in Scotland. So the question becomes, why did the government regime in Scotland not collapse? It should have collapsed. I mean, to many, to all intents and purposes, it should have collapsed. At some point between 1707 and 1745, it should have collapsed. And it doesn't. So the question becomes, not so much why the government failed, not so much why the Jacobites failed, but why the government succeeded. How does this Hanoverian government manage to hold on? Well, I think first and foremost, what you can say is that this is a reflection in part of genuine ideological belief in the righteousness of the Hanoverian kings to rule in Britain. Um, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had come in, it had kicked the Stuarts off the throne. The Stuarts had been Catholic. If you are a Protestant, you've got good reason probably to support the government. You might not like what the government's doing, but if the overthrow of that government is going to mean the return of Catholicism to Britain, you're probably going to be favourable to the government. And in fact, to be honest, it seems like Protestantism, and particularly Presbyterianism, is the most important dividing line in Scotland between Jacobite and supporter of the government. Of the 7 clans that overwhelmingly support the government, only one of them is not overwhelmingly Presbyterian. Almost all of the Jacobite clans are either Catholic or Episcopalian, and only one of them, the Macphersons, were largely Presbyterian. Now, and again, this is why this is all very complicated. Funnily enough, the Macphersons are one of the most notorious Jacobite clans. They're one of the most loyal to the Stuarts. They just happen to be Presbyterian. But I think there are good grounds for saying basically it's, the side of the religious divide you are on is the best indicator of which side of the political divide that you'll be on. Aside from kind of religion, you've also got politics. And there's a lot of Highlanders in this period that, they're not just sitting at home wishing for a return of Bonnie Prince Charlie. Many of them are actually very committed to the government. Many of them kind of look on the Glorious Revolution as a good thing. They see the Stuarts as absolutists. They see them, kind of like as somewhat dangerous. And therefore, they might not love the government, but it's the best of a bad choice as far as many of them are concerned. And some of them actually make very kind of sophisticated arguments about why the German kings, the Hanoverian kings, should be on the throne. There's one actual Highlander writing in 1745 who says that because George II had not endangered the liberties of his subjects, then the people have no right to overthrow him, which is an amazing kind of, John Locke style of argument, a good 30 years before American revolutionaries are going to use exactly the opposite logic to say King George III deserves to be overthrown because he has endangered the liberties of his American subjects. At the same time, the reluctance of many people to kind of support the Hanoverian regime full-heartedly should give us some pause for thought. There are, as I said, the Act of Union, the Treaty of Union, is deeply unpopular in Scotland. And one of the reasons it's unpopular is not just Scottish nationalism, but because what the Act of Union does is it drags Scotland into England's European wars. And this is deeply unpopular because wars are expensive and wars require people. It requires blood and treasure. And so from a Scottish point of view, what the Treaty of Union has actually effectively meant was that Scotland is getting dragged into England's wars. And this is particularly significant because of the way Britain fights wars in the 18th century. The major concern of Britain in the 18th century is the defeat of France. France is the most powerful state in Europe. It's the scariest state in Europe. It's the most absolutist state in Europe. Every energy that Britain has on the international front is effectively about trying to defeat France and, to a lesser extent, Spain, which is often allied to France. We often get monarchy wrong, I think. We assume that absolutist monarchies are very, very good about extracting resources from their people. If there's no limit on the king's power, it's very easy to take resources from your people. And so we kind of assume, in places like France and Spain, it was very easy for the French or Spanish kings, the Bourbon monarchs, to take what they wanted. That's actually not true. Absolutists are always very scared about public opinion because they know their regime does not rest on a huge amount of legitimacy. Britain is actually the opposite. Britain, after the Glorious Revolution, has a constitutional monarchy. It has a limited monarchy, but it also has a parliament, and it has representation in parliament. And what this means is that the British monarchies have this veneer of legitimacy, which means they can demand much more from their subjects than the French monarchy can. And that's actually the key to why Britain is able to fight France. France is much larger. France has more than double the number of people. France has more than double the amount of territory. And yet, over the course of the 18th century, Britain not only fights France, but eclipses it as the most important European power. How do they do this? Well, they do this by being able to extract more resources from the British people than the French monarchy can extract from the French people. Britain is far better at raising money than the French are. And in fact, over the course of the 18th century, the cost of raising money actually falls in Britain. It goes, like the interest rate on loans in Britain go from about 8 to 10% in the early decades of the 18th century to less than 5% by the end of the century. In other words, it's actually getting cheaper and cheaper to loan money. And the reason for this is because the British government appears legitimate and it always pays its debts. The French monarchy is not seen as legitimate. It's really bad at paying its debts. And when it can't pay its debts, it simply defaults. And which French subject who's just loaned the French king some money is going to turn around and complain at the end of it because he hasn't got his money back? It's just not practical. What I'm really getting at here is that the British are very, very good at raising men and resources. But from a Scottish perspective, the problem here is that this means that a lot of Scottish resources are being taken out of Scotland to fight these English wars against France. And that makes it deeply unpopular. Sorry, I should have thrown that up there when I was talking about the Glorious Revolution. I'm sorry, I'm a wee bit messed up a wee bit there. So where does this relate back to the Jacobites and to the 45 and to the independent companies? The key thing here, I think, is that the independent companies represent just how effective government patronage is in securing the loyalties of people in Scotland. The government can't convince Scots that the Treaty of Union is a good thing because the benefits of the empire have not demonstrated themselves yet, and Scottish resources are being taken out to fight against France. What they can do, however, is to kind of shift offices and opportunities and government posts and government positions, what we call the gravy train, to loyal allies in Scotland. And so the key kind of figures in this are the second and third Dukes of Argyll. These are brothers, and they are basically the ones that steer the gravy train. They are the ones that decide who gets appointments, who gets government posts, who gets government sinecures, who gets the money that the government is bringing in. And what this enables the government to do is to have far more control in Scotland than they might otherwise have done, because they're always able to turn around and say, hey, like, you stay loyal to us or you vote for us, and there might be a job opportunity coming for your nephew or your cousin. And that's how the government survives in Scotland. And these independent companies are exactly a kind of military version of this. These commissions that go out, they carry with them government pay. They carry with them status and opportunity. And what these officers do once they have these commissions is they basically operate like any 18th century army officer. They basically defraud the government with them. What they effectively do, or what they do most often, is to run what we call false musters. Effectively, they say, how many people have you got in your company? They'll say, we've got the full complement of 100. The reality might be that they've only got 50 men, but they're claiming double that, which means the government is paying them double that. And all that pay for those 50 men that don't exist, it goes straight into their pockets. And everybody knows this goes on. And yes, it's defrauding government. Yes, it's technically illegal, but everybody kind of does it, and everybody kind of understands it's just part of doing business. So these officers who are getting these commissions, they're taking advantage of government patronage. They're taking advantage of the fact that the government is willing to throw money at this problem. Now, there's very good reason why they do this as well, because although everybody knows that this is defrauding the government, they also know that the government is highly untrustworthy. And so what eventually happened is, after the rebellion had been suppressed, the government basically turns around and refuses to reimburse a large percentage of the expenses that were spent to fight the rebellion. And so it's highly likely that defrauding the government in this way was actually the only way that many of these officers managed to actually break even in financial terms. But I think what it tells us is just how important it was that the government is able to dispense this patronage. It's actually really difficult to imagine how the government would have survived in 1745, or indeed any time since 1707, had it not been for the ability to dispense army commissions, job opportunities, sinecures to major figures in the Scottish establishment. And this actually goes down to the very bottom of the pile as well. Ordinary Gaels, ordinary men who end up fighting these companies, they also take advantage of this. To join the companies, to volunteer for the companies, officers had to offer bounties. They basically said, if you join, we'll give you £3. Now, given that a standard, like an agricultural labourer in the Highlands, was probably only likely to earn about £6 a year at the time, £3 is a solid amount of money. Not only that, but most of these bounties are actually much higher than £3. £3 is the regulated amount, £3 is the legal amount you're allowed to offer. Most of these officers, because they need men in their companies, they're offering 12, 13, 14, 15 pounds. As I said before, Don Chaban, the poet who fought as the substitute for Archibald Fletcher of Cranach, he's paid £16 for his service. And so even down to the lowest level, there are good reasons why Gaels, when they're faced with the rebellion in 1745, should turn around and say, you know what, like, I don't necessarily really like the government. I don't necessarily really like the Act of Union with England. But on the one hand, you've got these mad Jacobite adventurers who want to turn the clock back and impose Catholicism. And on the other hand, you've got a guy offering me more than 2 years' wages to put on a uniform and fight against the rebels. It's for many of these guys, it's a no-brainer. I don't want to overly push the idea that it's just about, financial incentives. That would be unfair. And that's exactly why I said, concepts of religion and politics are really important. But I would make the case that that is why the Hanoverian regime survives in Scotland. It is the ability to dispense patronage, and in 1745 to dispense military patronage, that holds the whole thing together. I'll end there. I've said enough. I've probably said too much. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope I have not offended the MacLeods too much. So thank you so much.
Oh my goodness, absolutely brilliant, Matthew. And while we're requesting that everyone unmute your microphones and activate your cameras, please, I'll just mention a few of our confirmed 2026 speakers. In March, we have Professor Don Nurbas from McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And then followed by Professor Ewan Cameron from the University of Edinburgh and Dr. Giles Ingram, who will talk about Sir Walter Scott and Sir John McEwen, and on and on. And so we're hoping to see you here every month to support accurate Scottish history. Matthew, how can we thank you for your impeccably researched presentation? You are an ignoble academic and historian, and it's our honor to have you present to us today. I would like to open the floor to discussion with Professor Matthew Dziennik, please.
So thank you again, Professor. That was so interesting and amazing. So the French did not help the Jacobites in 46, but just 30 years later, they helped the colonials in America. So what was the biggest difference there when France came to the aid of America, young America, but they didn't come to the aid of those Jacobites?
That's an amazing question. I don't want to be too negative about the French. The French do help a little. They send money, they send arms, they send 2 regiments. But yeah, nothing like what they could have done. France's big problem is that France only cares about supporting the Jacobites in Scotland when they've got no other options. The problem is that when they have no other options, they've no longer got the resources to support Scotland. I think a smart French minister, a smart French king would have ploughed an awful lot of money into the Jacobite rebellion. I think that would have totally changed potentially European history. Why they support the United States when they didn't support the Jacobites, I think what it does is it comes down to duration and evidence that Britain can be defeated. So the Jacobite rebellion in total lasts about 8 months, maybe. And the Jacobites in that time don't really have enough time to demonstrate that they can defeat Britain. Yes, they do march into England, but they're only in England for about a month. That's it. In America, France has, 2 years of sitting on the side, more than 2 years of sitting on the sidelines, looking at this going, which way is it going to go? And then obviously Saratoga, they have evidence that, hey, these American rebels might actually be able to do something here. And that's when they commit. And I think that's probably the biggest difference. It's not so much ideology. I mean, yes, ideology is a small part of it. But to be perfectly honest, the French are going to support anybody that's fighting Britain. And so the fact that the Americans are talking about, liberty and the pursuit of happiness, things that are antithetical to the French monarchy, doesn't really matter so long as the American rebels can defeat Britain. But I think that's probably it. It's the Americans are able to demonstrate that they can beat Britain, whereas the Jacobites don't really have the time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fantastic question. Yeah. You can also, I wonder if I don't know this, but you can also make the case, the French, God love them, they do learn. And I think probably by the American Revolution, they're starting to, think, hey, we messed up in 1745. Maybe this is a chance to do something a little different.
Other questions or dialogue? Comments are welcome.
A question from Jim, I think.
Hi, good morning. Yes. I'm just curious to know, post-rebellion, given the fact that there were groups fighting on each side of the issue, let's say, how long did animosity exist, between the different segments of Scottish society that took one side or the other? And how deep was that animosity?
That is a fantastic question. It really depends. So there's a couple of famous stories. Walter Scott's, the famous novelist, actually involved in one of these stories. Apparently, I'm trying to remember the exact story now, but he's once refused entry to a house because his family had supported the government, and he goes to this house, like 50 years later, and he's refused entry for it. Like Scots have long memories. We're still talking about Bannockburn. At the same time, and this is something I think is really important to understand about Scotland in the 18th century, loyalties are so divided by, again, family, support for the government, religion, that there's this kind of understanding that if you want to operate anywhere, you kind of have to be a little forgiving. If you are not going to engage with anybody who has sympathy for the Stuarts, you're very quickly going to find that you can't talk to anybody. So I think there's a fair amount of kind of pragmatism on the part of Scots. They know that some of them are Jacobites. They know that some of them are government supporters. And unless there's actually an active rebellion going on, there's an amazing amount of connection and overlap and networking between them. The rebellion itself is pretty horrific, and the suppression of the rebellion is astonishingly horrifying. I mean, the murder of Jacobite prisoners after Culloden is very well known. What's less known is that the government probably starved 20,000 people to death after the battle, just by destroying livestock, taking away cows, destroying fields. So I don't want to downplay the extent to which these are brutal, nasty animosities that do last. But there is also this kind of pragmatism as well. And many Jacobites, in fact, after the rebellion is over, very quickly kind of shift their sails to the wind. They kind of understand, hey, that was the last throw of the dice. If I want to get on, if I want to secure for my family any opportunity, I very need to quickly turn around. And I'll very quickly just share one amazing story with you, which is kind of, wonderful. There's this guy called Malcolm MacPherson of Phones, who's part of the famous MacPherson clan, the Jacobite clan. He's an older guy. He was about 50 when the Jacobite rebellion happens, and he brings his supporters out for the Jacobites, and he fights with the Jacobites. 10 years later, he joins the British Army, and he ends up fighting for the British Army in Canada at the Siege of Quebec, where General Wolfe is killed. And he's 60 years old by this point. And after the battle, he gets taken to London. And this is right before George II dies. And he's taken for an audience with George II. And George II kind of asks him, look, like, you were fighting to topple me 10 years before, like, what, and now you've just secured Canada for me. Like, why the change? And Malcolm MacPherson turns around and he says, I wanted my revenge on the French for not supporting us. Which is, and this relates to the previous question, because the French didn't support us in 1745, I'm going to take Canada from the French for you. So, I mean, it really gives you kind of this, and whether he's joking, that may be, but it's this kind of pragmatism. I mean, the old joke about canny Scots, all stereotypes are wrong, but all stereotypes also have a grain of truth to them.
Cool. Thank you.
Hi. No, yeah, I hope that answered the question, Jim.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Hi, I've got a question here. You mentioned Walter Scott, so it seems that perhaps I was wondering what you thought about Robert Burns. Here we are in January, approaching Burns Day, and of course Robert Burns was a wee bit of a Jacobite, as well as being pragmatic.
Burns, yeah, and in actual fact, Burns is kind of a perfect kind of personification of these complexities, because you're absolutely right. I mean, he has these wonderful romantic sympathies towards Jacobitism, which I think many Scots did, and a lot of that comes from this kind of sense. I think I share Murray Pittock's opinion on this, which is a lot of this comes from Scottish nationalism. Like, many Scots remain very frustrated by the Union late into the 18th century. And Jacobitism kind of offers them a way of criticizing the Union. And it's also, somewhat romantic to do. But then Robert Burns also, yeah, he's highly pragmatic. I mean, he talks about, liberty and the opportunity of men. And yet at one point, he's very close to going to Jamaica to be an overseer on a plantation. He talks about supporting the ideals of the French Revolution, a man's a man for all that. And he also, helps establish voluntary defense forces to prevent any French invasion. I think what Burns really reveals to us wonderfully is just how complicated we are, both as Scots and also just as people. But I don't think I'd want to say anything further, because I'm not a Burns expert by any stretch. I'm not sure what you think yourself, John, about Burns.
Well, I find it interesting that his dad was from the northeast and used to work for the Duke of Marr and had to get out of Dodge right after the 45. Not quite clear whether he was whether it was money or whether there was a price on his head or what have you. But I find it interesting that he used to work, for the Duke of Marr up in the northeast there.
Aye, yeah.
Well, Jack, it's so good to see you. By the way, everyone, Jack is a governor on the Illinois St. Andrew Society, Chicago Scots, and has been for, I don't know how many years, Jack, but if it weren't for you, I don't know how we would have proceeded. So thank you.
Did somebody just say then that the Duke of Marr was a Jacobite?
Yeah, I believe he wasn't he? His castle was destroyed and he had to leave right after the 45, right?
So the Marr family are heavily Jacobite, and actually Marr commands Jacobite forces during the 1715 rebellion, which was actually, funnily enough, not as well remembered as the 1745 rebellion, but a larger rebellion in terms of numbers of men involved. And the Marr family are heavily involved in that. Off the top of my head, I'm struggling to think what exactly happens to the Marr family in the 45. I'd need to check up on that.
So I have a family member in the clan. Actually, it's the clan chief, the Strawn chief, who still wears the Marr tartan.
Oh, right.
Which is interesting.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'll if my I can give Connie, or you can get my email from Connie, and I'll have a look into the Mars, and I can get back to you on that one.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Matthew, I'll make every effort to post it right now on the chat.
One question I would have, it's pretty well known that with the American Revolution, at least initially, about a third of the people in America were Tories and Loyalists, a third didn't give a damn and wanted to be left alone, and a third were active patriots that were leading the rebellion. Do we have any idea of the numbers that way in Scotland? Because I know, for instance, my particular clan just sat the whole thing out.
Yeah, I honestly, like, so there's been a lot written about John Adams's kind of, estimation that's a third. I don't know, maybe I'm totally wrong here. I'm often of the opinion that it's really only about 20% of people on either side, and 60% just sit in the middle and try and avoid. That would be my guess, and I'm pretty sure that it's very similar in the Jacobite rebellion. But here's the thing that I find really important, and I've done a lot of military history, which is why I kind of think about this a lot. It's not so much your political allegiance that matters. It's not so much how willing you are to fight. It is how effectively one side or the other actually mobilizes resources. And I think during the Jacobite rebellion, because the government is highly effective at mobilizing resources, and because, to be honest, the Jacobites are quite effective at mobilizing resources, I think that's what determines which side people end up on. You're going to be a government loyalist if there's a government garrison down the road, in the same way that you're going to be a Jacobite loyalist as soon as that garrison gets overtaken by the Jacobites. And I think, in the American Revolution, I think it's a very kind of a relatively similar thing. Had the British Army been able to control large areas of territory, I think they would have had an awful lot more resources and an awful lot more loyalists signing up to fight for them. The fact that they can't control territory and resources means that they're always fighting an uphill battle in terms of kind of control. And from that point of view, I don't want to go too far here, but I would almost say that political leanings are less important than actually which side is more effective at controlling territory and resources. But to answer the specific question, it's really hard to kind of guess. The best guess is that about 20% of Highland men fight for the Jacobites, about 15% of Highland men fight for the government, which leaves you with what? Do my math here, 65% of Highland men that don't fight for either side.
So related to your last comments on the Revolutionary War, there were people who immigrated to the United States from Ulster after before and after 45, as well as from Scotland itself. And they fought on both sides, particularly in the Carolinas. And what's surprising to some people is that a lot of the Highlanders were on the Loyalist side, whereas more of the people, and it seems like there's partly a religious component to it too, that the people who are from the border areas and a few of the people from the Highland area that basically went through Northern Ireland and then came to the United States were all patriots. And they slaughtered each other. And a lot of the people on the Highlands ancestry were in North Carolina, and it seemed like some of the other ones were further west in North Carolina and over the mountains and in South Carolina that were, they called them Scotch Irish or Ulster Irish. They were almost from the same country but different. And I was just wondering, what your thoughts are, because I know it's been perplexing to some people why it is that the people from the Highlands, obviously intervening was a 7 Years' War as well, were fighting on the Loyalist side to a large extent rather than on the Patriot side.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's one of these things that, doesn't seem to make sense. One of what seems to be...
Jack, could I just call on Donald McLeod to answer that question before we move on?
Yeah.
And then, Jack, we'd love to entertain your next question. Donald.
Well, the great bulk of the Highlanders, other than coming down from Canada, came into North Carolina, and they had to take an oath to the King, King of England, to come in. The Scots Irish were different. And the Highlanders left Scotland because of the clan system breaking, chiefs not really supporting the clansmen, the clansfolk anymore. The Scots Irish left the lowlands of Scotland, went to Ulster, and later, 100 years later, came to America because of the abuses of the crown. They left Ireland hating the British crown. So the whole motivation there, and first of all, the Highlanders and the Lowlanders were like two different countries. Highlanders speaking Gaelic, and the Lowlanders speaking some kind of mongrel English. And so they were really two very different personalities, very different motivations coming to America and once they got here. Thank you.
And actually, Jack, if you'll indulge me, I'll add a comment. Many of the Scots under military employ were enticed, coerced, invited to join, and that's all I'll say. But Jack, what was your question, my dear? Jack, I believe you're muted. I didn't mean to intrude. Please forgive me.
I think you're muted, Connie.
I guess we lost Jack, which I apologize for and probably was responsible for. But Jack, in addition to being a governor on the Illinois St. Andrew Society for decades, owns the single Scottish restaurant and pub in Chicago, the Duke of Perth. And I encourage you all to visit it when you're here. And stay at my home, the Hotel Constance. Jack, how come you can't get unmuted? Darn you. Come on, I can't do it for you. Oh dear. You know, the Zoom technology has upgraded. I couldn't even get the videos started on time today. So I apologize, Jack. Please forgive us.
I really.
Oh, there we go. Thank you very much for your comments, Constance. I really didn't. I know this will come as a surprise, but I actually didn't have anything else to say. I don't know, but thank you very much for your comments about the Duke. You're all welcome to the Duke of Perth if you're in Chicago, and I look forward to seeing you at your house, Constance. I'll show up one day. Watch out.
You are welcome. You are welcome. Give me a little advance notice, please.
Okay.
Is the Duke of Perth named after the Jacobite commander?
Tell the story, Jack. Tell the story.
Oh my God! I don't know if you want to. I don't know if you want to hear. I don't know if you want to hear the story. But so my grandfather was a cinema manager in Perth in the just after just before the Second World War, at a time when cinema managers were a big deal. And he used to hear where all the parties, and he was a connoisseur of single malt whiskey, and that's another story. But he used to know where all the parties were in town, and he'd go up to the front door of the house and knock on the door, and the butler would answer the door, and the butler would say, "And who is this calling, sir?" And he would say, "Tell them it's the Duke of Perth." And he was in. So just as a kind of a, homage to my grandfather, we call the place the Duke of Perth.
Funny, so the Duke of Perth was one of two lieutenant generals in the Jacobite army. And he was quite a young guy. He was 33, and he's kind of overshadowed by the other lieutenant general, Lord George Murray. But the Duke of Perth, he was actually, he's quite a talented guy. He had very little experience, but he was really, really good at what he did. Kind of sad. His health, like, he survived the rebellion, but his health was kind of broken, and he died on his way to France, escaping Scotland after the rebellion.
Yeah, I don't think there is a Duke of Perth anymore. There's a dance for the
Duke and I think they got rid of the dukedom because this guy had supported the Jacobites.
Right. So we don't have any problems with calling the place the Duke of Perth. There's nobody.
Matthew. Oh, come now. Sorry, that was a joke.
Okay.
I think on that happy note, does anyone else have anything to add or ask or discuss? Well, I must say, I feel moved and almost tearful if it weren't for you all who participate in this forum every month. I'm not sure we'd be able to sustain the celebration of Scottish history in America. So it's all attributable to you, and we are honored and grateful that you all join each month, and we value your commentary. So until next month, I'll bid you adieu, and slán
Bye.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you.
Oh, I love you all.
Thank you, Connie.
Thanks, Connie.